The stars burned cold and distant beyond the viewport of the diplomatic vessel Horizon as Commander Cole stood watching the massive warship hanging in the darkness of space. The alien vessel was 3 kilometers long and covered in black armor that seemed to swallow light itself. Red symbols glowed along its hull like wounds that refused to heal. Behind it waited 200 more ships just like it, an armada that had crushed entire civilizations without mercy or pause. Had studied them for 6 months before this mission. He knew their history better than most humans knew their own. For 3,000 years they had swept across the galaxy like a burning wind, and every species that stood before them had fallen. The Galactic Assembly called them dragons because of their massive scaled bodies, their ability to breathe superheated plasma, and their war cries that could shatter bones and break minds. No one had ever successfully negotiated with them. No one had ever tried and survived. Lucy Warren stood at the communications station behind, her fingers hovering over her console as she monitored the incoming transmission request from the flagship. She was young for her position, only 28 years old, but she had earned her place through skill and dedication. Right now her face was pale with worry she could not hide. The Galactic Assembly had sent humanity to this negotiation because they expected failure. Humans had only been part of the Assembly for 40 years, a minor species with no real power or influence. They were expendable. Knew this. Lucy knew this. Everyone on the Horizon knew this, but had volunteered anyway because he believed something that no other species seemed willing to consider. He believed that could be reached. The transmission connected, and the main filled with the image of Warlord. Had seen recordings of before, but nothing had prepared him for the reality. Stood nearly 4 meters tall, his body covered in scales the color of dried blood. His eyes burned yellow like twin suns, and when he opened his mouth, could see rows of teeth designed for tearing flesh from bone. Steam rose from his nostrils with every breath, and the temperature on the bridge seemed to rise just from looking at him. Behind stood dozens of warriors, each one carrying weapons that looked like they had been forged in some ancient nightmare. They wore armor made from the bones of their enemies, and their faces showed nothing but contempt for the small pink creature that dared to appear on their screen. Spoke first, his voice a deep rumble that made the speakers crackle with distortion. He spoke in his own language, a series of growls and hisses that the translation software struggled to process. The words that came through were simple and direct. He demanded to know why the Assembly had sent insects to speak with dragons. He demanded to know if this was meant as an insult. Opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, released his war cry. The sound hit the horizon like a physical force. Every speaker on the ship screamed with feedback. Crew members grabbed their ears and fell to their knees. Lucy cried out and ducked beneath her console. On other assembly ships monitoring the transmission, knew that alien crew members were fleeing their stations in terror. Some species would be rendered unconscious by the sound. Others would suffer permanent hearing damage. This was the way. They did not negotiate. They dominated. But did not move. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and his eyes fixed on thee as the roar washed over him. His ears rang and his head pounded, and somewhere deep in his chest he felt his heart racing with primal fear. But he did not flinch. He did not look away. He simply waited. The roar lasted for nearly 30 seconds before finally closed his mouth. The silence that followed felt almost painful. On the warlord's eyes narrowed as he studied with new interest. Around him, his warriors exchanged glances that might have been confusion. Waited 3 more seconds before he spoke. His voice was calm and steady, showing none of the fear that still made his hands want to shake. He thanked for the traditional greeting and said that he was honored to receive it. He introduced himself and explained that he had come to speak with the warlord about matters that concerned both their species. Leaned forward, his massive head filling more of the screen. He asked why this human had not run. He asked why this human had not screamed or begged or fallen like all the others. There was something in his voice that had not expected. Curiosity. Answered honestly. He explained that humans had evolved on a world filled with predators, a world where fear was constant but survival depended on controlling that fear rather than being controlled by it. He said that he respected the power of but respect and terror were not the same thing. The bridge of the flagship had gone completely silent, stared at for a long moment, and could not read the expression on that alien face. Finally, the warlord spoke again. He said that was either very brave or very foolish, and he had not yet decided which. Said that he hoped to prove it was the former. Then he made a request that made Lucy gasp behind him. He asked for permission to board the flagship alone so that they could speak face to face as equals. The warriors behind erupted in what could only interpret as laughter. The sound was harsh and cruel, like stones grinding together. One of them shouted that the human wanted to die faster. Another suggested they should grant the request and see how long the little creature lasted in their atmosphere. But held up one massive clawed hand, and the laughter stopped instantly. He studied again with those burning yellow eyes. Then he spoke words that had never been spoken to any outsider in 3,000 years of history. He granted permission. He said the human could board his ship and speak with him directly. Nodded once and turned away from the screen. Lucy was standing now, her face a mixture of fear and disbelief. She grabbed his arm and asked him what he was doing. She said he would die over there. She said the heat alone would kill him, and if it did not, the certainly would. Placed his hand over hers and told her that this was why they had come. He said that someone had to take the first step, and he was willing to be that someone. He asked her to trust him. Lucy did not let go. She told him that trust would not keep him alive. Smiled and said that perhaps not, but it was a start. He gently removed her hand and walked toward the shuttle bay, leaving behind a crew that watched him go in stunned silence. As he prepared the shuttle for launch, thought about everything that waited for him on that ship. The heat that could cook a human alive. The warriors who had killed millions. The warlord who had never shown mercy to anyone. He thought about all the ways this could go wrong, all the ways he could die in the next hour. Then he launched the shuttle and flew toward the dragon's den, carrying nothing but his words and his hope that somewhere beneath all that fire, they were still capable of listening. The shuttle bay of the flagship was designed to intimidate, and it succeeded. Stepped out of his small vessel into a cavern of black metal and red light that stretched so far he could barely see the walls. The air hit him like a wall of fire, thick with sulfur and heat that made his lungs burn with every breath. The temperature was over 50 degrees, hot enough to kill most species within minutes. Had prepared for this. He wore a thin, cooling suit beneath his uniform that would keep his core temperature stable for several hours. But he had chosen to wear minimal visible protection because his research had taught him something important about They respected those who endured hardship without complaint. They despised weakness in all its forms. A squad of warriors waited for him at the far end of the bay. They towered over him like mountains of scale and muscle, each one carrying weapons that looked capable of cutting through starship armor. Their eyes tracked his every movement as he walked toward them, and could feel their hatred like heat radiating from a furnace. The leader of the squad stepped forward and spoke in broken common, the trading language of the galaxy. He said that would follow them to the war chamber where waited. He said that if tried to run or fight, he would be torn apart before he could take 2 steps. Thanked him for the information and said he had no intention of running. The walk through the ship took nearly 20 minutes. Every corridor was built for creatures 3 times size, and he had to move quickly to keep pace with his escorts. The walls were decorated with trophies from 1,000 conquered worlds, skulls of species recognized, and many he did not hung from hooks and chains. Battle standards taken from defeated enemies lined the passages like a gallery of death. Studied everything as they walked. He noted the way the warriors moved, the hierarchy in their formations, the subtle signs of communication between them. He saw older warriors with scars covering their bodies and younger ones whose scales still held the brightness of youth. He saw females among them too, just as large and deadly as the males, their eyes watching him with the same cold calculation. The war chamber was a massive circular room at the heart of the ship. Its ceiling rose so high that it disappeared into shadow, and its floor was marked with symbols that recognized from his studies as records of victories. Thousands of symbols covered every surface, each one representing a world burned or a species conquered. Sat on a throne made from the fused remains of enemy warships. The metal had been twisted and melted into a seat that looked more like a monument to destruction than a piece of furniture. The warlord watched enter with those burning yellow eyes, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then rose from his throne and descended the steps toward. Each footfall shook the floor. Steam poured from his nostrils with every breath. He stopped less than 2 meters from, close enough that the human could feel the heat radiating from his massive body. Spoke in his own language, and a device on his chest translated his words into common. He said that was smaller than he had expected. He said that humans looked fragile, like creatures that would break under the slightest pressure. Agreed that humans were small and physically weak compared to the. He said that this was why humans had learned to survive through other means. Asked what means those were. Said he would be happy to explain, but first he wanted to thank the warlord for allowing this meeting. Made a sound that might have been a laugh. He said that should not thank him yet. He said that the meeting had not ended and many things could still happen. Then he leaned down until his face was level with, and released another roar directly at him. The sound was even worse at close range. Felt his bones vibrating and his vision blurring from the sheer force of it. Blood began to trickle from his nose and his ears rang with pain, but he stood his ground. He kept his eyes open and fixed on, refusing to look away even as every instinct screamed at him to flee. When the roar ended, pulled back and studied with something new in his expression. He called out to his warriors and said words that made them shift uncomfortably. He said that this human had more fire in him than species 10 times his size. Wiped the blood from his nose and said that fire came in many forms. He said that they had physical fire, but humans had a different kind. The fire of determination. The fire of refusing to give up even when everything seemed hopeless. Returned to his throne and gestured for to approach. He said that he had killed negotiators from 12 different species in this very room. He said that some had begged for mercy and some had tried to fight, and some had simply collapsed from fear. He asked what made him think this meeting would end differently. Walked forward until he stood at the base of the throne. He looked up at the massive warlord and spoke without hesitation. He said that he thought this meeting would end differently because he had not come to beg or fight or collapse. He had come to understand. The warriors around the room reacted with surprise and anger. Some stepped forward with weapons raised. Others shouted that this human dared to claim he could understand them. Silenced them with a gesture and asked to explain what he meant. Said that every species in the galaxy saw thee as monsters. They saw the destruction and the conquest and the endless war, and they assumed that they were simply evil, but had studied their history. He had learned their language and their customs and their beliefs, and he had come to a different conclusion. He said that they were not monsters, they were survivors. Everything they did, every world they burned, and every species they crushed was done in service of one goal: survival. Said that he understood this because humans had faced the same choice in their own history: destroy or be destroyed, conquer or perish. Was silent for a long moment. The warriors around the room had stopped moving, stopped breathing, waiting for their leader to respond. Finally leaned forward on his throne and asked a question that no outsider had ever been asked before. He asked how knew that they were fighting for survival. He asked what had learned that others had not. Took a deep breath and prepared to share the secret he had discovered. The secret that had brought him to this ship and this moment. the secret that might get him killed or might change the course of galactic history. He looked directly in the eyes and said that he knew they were dying. He knew that their population had been declining for 500 years. He knew that all the conquest and all the destruction was a desperate attempt to find a solution to a problem that war could not solve. The silence that followed was the deepest had ever experienced. Then rose from his throne with murder in his eyes. Moved faster than had thought possible for a creature so large. One moment the warlord was rising from his throne, and the next his clawed hand was wrapped around his throat, lifting him off the ground like he weighed nothing at all. The heat from his body was overwhelming, and could feel his skin beginning to blister where the scales touched him. The warriors around the room drew their weapons and roared their approval. They wanted blood. They wanted to see this human torn apart for speaking forbidden knowledge. Could feel his vision darkening as the claws tightened around his throat, but he did not struggle. He did not beg. He simply met the warlord's burning eyes and waited. Demanded to know how had learned this secret. He demanded to know who had told him. His voice shook with rage, but beneath the anger heard something else. Fear. The kind of fear that came from having your deepest wound exposed to an enemy. Could barely speak with the claws around his throat, but he forced the words out anyway. He said that no one had told him. He said that he had figured it out himself by studying expansion patterns, population records, and the chemical composition of their atmosphere. He said that humans were very good at finding patterns that others missed. Held him for another moment, then threw him across the room. Hit the floor hard and rolled several times before coming to a stop against the base of a pillar. His throat burned and his body ached, but nothing seemed to be broken. He pushed himself to his knees and looked back at the warlord. The chamber had gone completely silent. Stood in the center of the room with his fists clenched and his chest heaving. Around him, his advisors and warriors watched with expressions that ranged from rage to uncertainty. One of them, a younger warrior with scales that still held a greenish tint, stepped forward and spoke. This warrior introduced himself as, and he asked what they should do. He said that killing the human would not change the fact that their secret was known. He asked if perhaps they should hear what the human had to say. Several older warriors shouted down. They said he was young and foolish. They said the only response to this insult was death. They said the human should be burned alive and his ashes scattered across the void, but held up his hand and silenced them all. He walked back to and stood over him, blocking out the red light of the chamber. He asked why had revealed this knowledge. He asked what hoped to gain by exposing the deepest shame of the people. Got to his feet slowly, ignoring the pain in his body. He said that he had not come to expose anything. He had not come to shame thee or use their secret against them. He had come because he believed he could help. The warriors laughed at this. They mocked and called him arrogant. They asked how a tiny creature from a minor species could possibly help the mightiest civilization in the galaxy, but did not laugh. He watched with those burning eyes and waited for him to continue. Explained that humanity had faced extinction many times in its history. He talked about ice ages and plagues and wars that had nearly wiped them out completely. He talked about how humans had learned to adapt, to change, to find solutions to problems that seemed impossible. He said that the approach of conquest and expansion had worked for 3,000 years, but it was not working anymore. The problems facing them could not be solved by burning other planets. Asked what solution was proposing. His voice was quieter now, almost thoughtful. Recognized this as progress and chose his next words carefully. He said that humanity had developed terraforming technology that could restore dying worlds. He said that human scientists had figured out how to repair damaged atmospheres, revive poisoned soil, and bring dead planets back to life. He said that this technology could save thee if they were willing to accept help. The chamber erupted in chaos. Warriors shouted over each other, some demanding death and others asking questions about this technology. Moved closer too, his young face showing something that might have been hope. The older advisors gathered around, speaking rapidly in their own language too fast for the translator to keep up. Listened to all of them without speaking. Then he raised his voice and silenced the room once more. He turned back to and asked the most important question of all. He asked why humans would help the. He said that his people had done nothing but destroy and conquer. He said they had never shown mercy to anyone. He asked what humans could possibly gain by saving a species that the rest of the galaxy wanted dead. Had been waiting for this question. He had rehearsed his answer 100 times during the journey to this system, but now that the moment had come, he set aside his prepared words and spoke from his heart instead. He said that humans would help because they understood what it meant to be desperate. They understood what it meant to watch your world dying and feel powerless to stop it. They understood the fear that drove species to terrible acts when survival was at stake. He said that humans looked at the and did not see monsters. They saw a reflection of what humanity could have become if they had not found another way. He said that the galaxy was full of species that judged each other by their worst moments. Humans had been judged that way too when they first joined the assembly. Many species still thought of humans as primitive and violent because of their history, but believed that every species deserved a chance to become something better than their past. Was silent for a long time. The warriors around him shifted uncomfortably, unused to seeing their leader so quiet and thoughtful. Watched with undisguised interest, his young eyes moving between and the warlord. Finally spoke. He said that was either the bravest creature he had ever met or the most foolish. He said that he had killed thousands of beings with his own claws and had never once regretted it. He asked why he should believe that this small human was telling the truth about wanting to help. Said that had no reason to believe him yet. He said that trust was not built with words but with actions. He proposed a demonstration. He said that humanity could send a single terraforming ship to the most damaged world and show them what the technology could do. If it worked, they could discuss a larger agreement. If it did not work, would lose nothing. The older advisors protested. They said this could be a trick to get a human ship past their defenses. They said the terraforming vessel could be carrying weapons or spies, but spoke up again and said that the human had walked into their flagship alone and unarmed. He asked how much more trust they expected this small creature to show. Looked at with something that might have been approval. Then he turned back to and said he would consider the proposal. He said that would remain on the flagship as a guest while he made his decision. Notice that he said guest and not prisoner, and he took this as a sign of progress. As warriors escorted to quarters that had been prepared for him, fell into step beside them. The young warrior spoke quietly so the others would not hear. He said that what had done today was either very wise or very dangerous. Said that sometimes those two things were the same. Made a sound that might have been a laugh and said that perhaps humans were more interesting than he had thought. 3 days passed aboard the flagship while deliberated with his advisors. Spent most of that time in quarters that were uncomfortably hot but otherwise adequate. Visited him twice each day, bringing food that humans could actually digest and asking questions about Earth and human history. Answered every question honestly, recognizing that the young warrior was trying to understand humans the same way had tried to understand the. On the horizon, Lucy Warren worked without sleep. She monitored every communication channel, tracked every ship movement, and waited for word from. The rest of the crew handled their duties in tense silence, unsure whether their commander was still alive or whether they would soon be fleeing for their lives. On the morning of the 4th day, Lucy intercepted a transmission that made her blood run cold. The signal was encrypted with Galactic Assembly military codes, and it took her 2 hours to break through the security layers. When she finally read the contents, she understood why it had been hidden so carefully. The Galactic Assembly had never intended for the negotiations to succeed. They had sent humanity to this meeting as a distraction, a sacrificial offering to keep the occupied. Hidden behind a nearby nebula waited an assembly strike fleet of over 300 warships, armed with weapons specifically designed to penetrate armor. The plan was simple. When negotiations failed, as everyone expected they would, the assembly would attack. They would blame the for breaking the ceasefire and use the incident to justify a full-scale war. Lucy sat at her console with the transmission glowing on her screen and faced the hardest decision of her life. If she stayed silent, the attack would proceed. They would be caught off guard and thousands would die in the first strike. Might survive if she warned him in time to escape, but the alliance he was trying to build would be destroyed before it could begin. If she warned about the attack, she would be committing treason against the Galactic Assembly. Her career would be over. She might spend the rest of her life in a military prison. Her family would bear the shame of her betrayal. Everything she had worked for would be gone. Lucy thought about standing alone on that bridge, refusing to flinch even when death screamed in his face. She thought about what he had said before he left. Someone has to take the first step. Then she began typing a coded message that would change the course of history. Received the transmission during his evening meal with. He read it twice to make sure he understood, then sat in silence for a long moment while the young watched him with concern. Asked what was wrong. Told him that he needed to speak with immediately. The war chamber was full when arrived. Sat on his throne with his advisors arranged around him, and from their postures guessed they had been arguing about the human proposal for hours. All conversation stopped when entered, and dozens of hostile eyes tracked him as he walked to the center of the room. Demanded to know why had requested this audience. He said that he had not yet made his decision about the terraforming demonstration. Said that the decision had become more urgent and that he had information the warlord needed to hear. Then did something that shocked everyone in the room, including himself. He shared Lucy's message. He told about the hidden assembly fleet, the planned attack, and the trap that had been set. He explained that the assembly had never intended to make peace with the. They had sent humans to die and were planning to use their deaths as an excuse for war. The chamber exploded with rage. Warriors roared and smashed their fists against walls and demanded immediate retaliation. Advisors shouted about treachery and called for the assembly fleet to be hunted down and destroyed. Through it all, sat motionless on his throne, watching with an expression that was impossible to read. When the chaos finally subsided, one of the older advisors stepped forward and pointed at. He demanded to know why the human had shared this information. He said that could have used the attack to escape. He could have let the assembly fleet strike and slipped away in the confusion. Instead, he had exposed his own people's treachery and placed himself at even greater risk. The advisor demanded to know what game was playing. Said he was not playing any game. He said that he had come to thee in good faith, and he refused to let that faith be destroyed by the actions of leaders who did not speak for all of humanity. He said that some humans wanted peace and were willing to risk everything to achieve it. Lucy had proven that by sending the warning, was proving it by standing here now. Finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the chamber like thunder. He asked if he understood what he had done. He said that by sharing this information, had committed treason against the Galactic Assembly. He said that could never go back to his own people. He asked if had considered this before he spoke. Said that he had considered it. He said that doing the right thing sometimes meant sacrificing everything. He said that peace between humans and was worth more than his career, his freedom, or his life. The chamber was silent again, but this time the silence felt different. The rage had faded, replaced by something had not expected to see on faces. Respect. Stepped forward and stood beside. He spoke directly to and said that this human had proven his worth. He said that had walked into their ship alone, endured their tests without breaking, and now had betrayed his own people to protect them. Said he had never seen such courage from any species, and he asked to consider what this meant. rose from his throne and descended the steps until he stood before once more. But this time, there was no threat in his posture. He placed one massive clawed hand on shoulder, careful not to crush him, and spoke words that had not been spoken to any outsider in 3,000 years of history. He called friend. He said that they had judged humanity by the actions of their leaders, but had shown him that individuals could be different from their governments. He said that if there were more humans-like, perhaps the galaxy was not as hopeless as he had believed. Then made a decision that stunned his advisors and warriors alike. He ordered the entire fleet to power down their weapons and lower their shields. He said that he was placing himself and his people under protection. He said that when the assembly fleet arrived, they would find the standing beside humanity, not against it. Felt tears forming in his eyes, and he did not try to hide them. He thanked and promised that he would do everything in his power to honor this trust, made that rumbling sound that might have been a laugh, and said that had already done more than any being in history. Now they would face whatever came next together. Back on the horizon, Lucy received word that was alive and that the situation had changed dramatically. She began preparing a broadcast that would be sent to every ship and every world in the region. The truth was about to come out, and nothing would ever be the same. The Galactic Assembly Strike Fleet emerged from behind the nebula, expecting to find chaos and destruction. Instead, they found something that made their commanders freeze at their stations. The Armada hung in space with weapons powered down and shields lowered. The diplomatic vessel Horizon sat between the two fleets, broadcasting on every frequency in the known galaxy. Lucy's voice carried across the void, calm and clear and impossible to ignore. She played the intercepted transmission that revealed the Assembly's planned betrayal. She showed the orders that proved the attack was premeditated. She explained that they had chosen peace over war, and that any attack now would be unprovoked aggression witnessed by the entire galaxy. On 100 worlds, billions of beings watched their screens in shock. Species that had lived in fear of them for thousands of years saw the mighty Armada standing down. They heard its voice explaining what had happened, how understanding had been reached, how trust had been built one impossible moment at a time. They saw something that most of them had believed could never happen. The Assembly Fleet Commander faced an impossible choice. His orders were clear, but those orders had been given in secret with the assumption that no one would ever know the truth. Now the truth was everywhere. If he attacked, he would be striking an enemy that had surrendered. If he would be admitting that the Assembly had planned an act of treachery that violated every treaty they had ever signed. The commander chose to withdraw. His ships turned and disappeared into hyperspace, fleeing not from weapons but from the judgment of an entire galaxy that had witnessed their shame. Within hours, the Assembly leadership that had planned the attack began resigning from their positions. Within days, new leaders emerged who promised to investigate what had happened and ensure it never happened again. Stood on the observation deck of the flagship and watched the Assembly fleet vanish. Beside him stood the warlord who had terrorized the galaxy for 200 years. Behind them stood a dozen warriors who had once considered humans to be insects worth crushing. Now they stood together as something new, something unprecedented. Spoke quietly, his deep voice carrying a weight of emotion that had not heard before. He said that for 3,000 years, they had believed strength was the only thing that mattered. They had burned worlds and crushed civilizations because they thought this was the path to survival. He said that had shown him another path, and he did not know how to thank him for it. Said that thanks were not necessary. He said that what they had built together was worth more than any words, but he also said that their work was just beginning. The galaxy would take time to accept this alliance. There would be those on both sides who wanted it to fail. They would need to prove themselves again and again before trust became permanent. 6 months later, the first human terraforming ship arrived at Prime. The planet's atmosphere had been dying for centuries, poisoned by the volcanic activity that gave their heat and their fire. Human scientists worked alongside engineers to deploy technology that had never been tested on such a scale. Lucy coordinated the operation from orbit, having been promoted to captain of a new vessel specifically designed for human joint missions. The process was slow and difficult. There were setbacks and arguments and moments when the alliance seemed ready to collapse, but it worked through every problem together, modeling the patience and understanding they wanted their peoples to learn. Became a bridge between the two species, learning human languages and customs and teaching ways in return. After 3 months of work, the first results became visible. Plants that had not grown on Prime for 1,000 years began sprouting in test gardens. Water that had been toxic for generations ran clear in restored rivers. The air itself began to change, becoming breathable for species beyond themselves. For the first time in living memory, they could see a future that did not depend on conquest. Word spread across the galaxy. Other species that had lived in fear of the began sending cautious messages of interest. Some wanted to know if the alliance was real. Others wanted to know if they could join. The assembly, still recovering from the shame of their exposed treachery, watched nervously as a new power block formed around a partnership they had tried to destroy. 1 year after first boarded the flagship, a ceremony was held in the war chamber where he had nearly died. Representatives from 12 species filled the room, standing where skulls and battle trophies had once hung. The walls had been cleaned and repainted with new symbols. Not symbols of conquest, but symbols of alliance and hope. Stood before the assembled crowd and spoke words that would be recorded in the histories of 100 worlds. He said that they had spent 3,000 years roaring at the galaxy, and the galaxy had learned to fear that roar. He said that fear had kept them safe for a time, but it had also kept them alone. He said that one human had changed everything by refusing to be afraid and choosing instead to listen. Stood beside him, looking small and fragile next to the massive warlord, but no one in that room thought of him as weak. They had all heard the stories. They knew what this human had risked and what he had achieved. When finished speaking, stepped forward to say his own words. He said that he had not come to be a hero. He had come because he believed that every species had more in common than they had in conflict. He said that humans had both evolved on dangerous worlds, had both faced extinction, had both learned to survive against impossible odds. These shared experiences were stronger than any differences. He said that the galaxy was full of fear and suspicion, and that these things would not disappear overnight. But he believed that if two species as different as humans could find common ground, then perhaps there was hope for everyone. He asked the assembled representatives to carry this message back to their worlds. He asked them to choose understanding over fear. When he finished speaking, released a roar that shook the chamber. But this time the roar was not a challenge or a threat. For the first time in history, it was a sound of welcome and celebration. Around the room, warriors joined their voices to their warlords, creating a wall of sound that seemed to shake the stars themselves. And in the middle of that thundering chorus, Cole smiled. The dragon had roared and the human had spoken, and somehow against all odds they had found a way to hear each other. That was enough. That was everything. It was the beginning of a new age, born not from war or conquest, but from the simple decision to try understanding before destruction. Lucy stood near the back of the room, watching the ceremony with tears in her eyes. Beside her, leaned down and spoke quietly. He asked if all humans were as stubborn as. Lucy laughed and said that stubbornness was one of humanity's greatest traits. Made that grinding sound that served as laughter and said he was beginning to understand why humans had survived so long on their dangerous world. As the ceremony ended and the representatives began to mingle and talk, found a quiet corner and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there was Earth, the small blue world where his species had learned to turn fear into courage and conflict into cooperation. He hoped that what had happened here would make Earth proud. found him standing alone and joined him at the window. The warlord said nothing for a long moment, then spoke in a voice so quiet almost missed it. He said that he had been fighting his whole life, and he was tired. He said that had given him something he had never expected to find, a reason to stop fighting, a reason to hope. Placed his small hand on the warlord's massive arm and said that hope was just the beginning. Together, they would build something that lasted. Together, they would prove that even the greatest enemies could become the closest friends. Outside the window, the stars burned on as they always had, but something had changed. The galaxy was watching, and for the first time in 3,000 years, it was watching with hope instead of fear.